G'day, I'm at Solduck Springs. One of the things that's worth looking for when you're out shooting is some intimate landscapes, not necessarily just looking for the big broad landscape or walking kilometres up a mountain path to get to a fantastic looking waterfall, but just have a close look at what's around you. I'm going to shoot a few shots around here. In particular, to start with, these aspen trees with the new growth coming off the trunk and the ferns in the foreground and the maple leaves in the background. But you don't have to travel far. I'm cheating. I'm right in the car park. So have a look around wherever you are. There's always something worth shooting. Okay, so you found your composition. Next thing to do is, oh, will you go away? Okay, once you've found your composition, I've just taken a test shot. Now to look at the settings. This looks like quite a simple composition, but it's quite challenging to get the settings exactly right. So the first thing to do is to think about the depth of field that you want. I want everything from the fronds of these ferns in the foreground through to the ferns and the maple trees in the background to be completely sharp and in focus, at least as a starting point. I might later on choose to blur out some of the background to emphasize the trunks of the trees and so on here, but at a starting point I want to get that full depth of field. So I'm going to have to be shooting at quite a narrow aperture, probably about f11 to f16. I'm going to start at f11 and see that if that works. The next thing I need to think about is shutter speed. Because there's a slight gusty breeze coming through here, it means that the leaves in the midground and the fronds of these ferns are moving. They're only moving subtly, but it's quite dark where I'm shooting. So at the moment on aperture f11 at, I'll just adjust it back down, at ISO 100, I'm shooting for 2 seconds. And that's just going to be way too long with the movement of those leaves. So I'm going to bump the ISO up to 800, which gives me a quarter of a second. Now, a quarter of a second is still quite a slow shutter speed, but it should be enough to freeze just gentle movement in here. So I've got to wait for a lull in the breeze to shoot that. But that's where you need to be thinking all the time about that relationship between depth of field, shutter speed and ISO, and adjusting those to suit your needs. In this case, the thing that is constant for me though, the one that I can't change, is the depth of field. So I leave the aperture the way I want it at f11. So once you've taken the shot that you think you want, always come and check out the back of the screen. It's much easier to check it out now than it is to come back next time and shoot it, and particularly when you are like I am at the moment on the other side of the world. I may never come back here again. So always check that you've got the exposure right before you move on. Now often I bracket my shots, but there's not a lot of point in bracketing here because I can get the full dynamic range, and you can see here from the left hand side or the bottom here, I'm not blocking out the blacks and I'm just touching the top of the histogram there, which indicates that I'm blowing out a little tiny bit of the whites. And if I blow this up and show you where they are, there's a couple little white patches on the bark of these trees, but I don't mind that. And remember that I'm looking at a JPEG image here on the back of the camera, and a JPEG image has a restricted dynamic range in comparison with the original RAW. So I probably won't have anything blown out in the original RAW, and even if I do, I don't mind those little white patches on the trunks of the trees anyway. The next thing to think about is once you've taken your shot, whether it's a horizontal or a vertical, switch over to the other one. You never know when you're going to get something that is going to be a better shot or an equally good shot or just a different shot by choosing a horizontal versus a vertical and so on. My eye was immediately drawn to this as a vertical because I wanted to be drawing the eye out of the foreground with these deep green ferns up and away through the top of the image by the two lines of the trunks of these trees. But it's always possible that you might find something by switching to horizontal. Now I'm going to take the horizontal shot without changing anything. I've just switched over on the L bracket, so I'm focusing in the center of this image in exactly the same spot. Obviously I'm now wider than I am high, but I'll take this shot and have a look at it, and it doesn't really work for me because it isolates those two vertical branches in the middle of a shot with not a lot going on around it. However, if I tip this slightly forwards and I zoom in and just concentrate on the tops of these ferns on the right hand side and the tops of the new growth with just a little bit of the trunks of those trees in the background. Now I have to check focus as well. So I switch over to manual focus, and if I click the OK button on this camera, you'll have to check your own settings on your camera. I click the OK button on here, it takes me into a 4x view, and I can adjust that and go in even narrower if I want to. I can jump into about a 10x view. And now I can adjust that focus to get it exactly right. The other thing that is important to do, if you've got the ability to shut your aperture down and get that depth of field preview, is to give that a go as well. Now I can do that here, and I can see in here that the entire foreground and background is going to be in focus as well. So I'm going to take that shot as well. And I quite like that because it's focusing in on that central bit, and it's looking at the different textures and colours in the leaves, whereas the first shot was more about lines and verticality in it. So So I'm going to look around here for a couple more shots and see if I can find anything. One of the things that hits my eye when I first came here was the maple leaves, the lighter green maple leaves set against a darker background. So I'm going to try and find a spot where I can isolate those. Sometimes it's quite difficult to do, but I'll give it a go and see if I can find it. But I might also look down and look at some of the ferns, because the growth of ferns, where they're coming out of that central growth and the fronds coming out around it, can quite often lead you into the center of the image if you can find a shot and simplify just the fronds of the ferns. So some things to think about when you're out shooting. Just keep looking for colors and patterns and lines. It doesn't matter whether I'm shooting a tree or I'm shooting ferns. That's not the point when I'm trying to compose an image. What I'm trying to compose an image of is colors, shapes, lines, textures.